Hello, everybody, and welcome to the 178th edition of the Frank and Stan Chat. And I hope there are many younger viewers and listeners coming into this recording because we have a special World Book Day edition. And every year for the last 3 years, we've invited a good friend of ours, a children's author called Dan Worsley. And good morning, Dan.
Morning.
Yeah. So every week, the guy wearing the red top, who's Stan Johnson, and myself, we meet and we chat for about half an hour or so, and we generally invite a guest. And it's all to do with education, but this is a special World Book Day edition. So we're going to focus very much on you as a reader, you as a writer, you as a listener, you as a speaker. And we hope that you get a lot out of this, and we hope that your teacher is inspired to, if they're watching, or inspired to share the video with the class or with a group of children. And as part of this edition, we're going to ask Dan to lead us through some sort of activities, some thinking that he's been doing, the way he works, which you may want to emulate back in class after the recording. So, Stan, how are you this morning with your funky Salford Reds top on?
The season started. We're unbeaten, but that'll end tonight.
So yeah, the rugby league season. Yeah, it's been an interesting week for me. I've stopped doing some work in Blackpool, and I'm moving on to doing some other work around some other northern councils and towns. So anyway, Stan and I were both head teachers. We've known each other for a very long time, since sort of 1995, I think it was. Yeah. So anyway, and we've known Dan for I think 4 or 5 years. So welcome, Dan. So before we come in, well, do you want to just explain who you are and what you do, and then we'll get into
it? Yeah. It's good to be back for my hat trick appearance. Third appearance, amazing, absolutely fantastic. So I'm a children's author and a performance storyteller. And I think the first bit explains itself, the author bit. You know, when I ask in schools, the children say, you make stories, you put them in books, and that's pretty much it. The storytelling is a little bit more complicated, really. So rather than reading my stories when I go to schools, I put on my multicolored storytelling waistcoat and I perform them. So I bring them to life in almost a physical performance. So that's my job. And I go around libraries, schools, pretty much across the country, sometimes virtually across the world, engaging children, getting children excited about reading, writing, and hopefully stoking those literary fires.
Now, you were a primary school teacher, weren't you?
So that started off, I'm trying to think back now in the sands of time. So 1998, I qualified as a primary school teacher in Blackpool. And before I go any further, I've got to say thank you so much for all the work, Frank, that you've done in Blackpool and all the connections you've built, and all, because Blackpool, you know, a place close to my heart. I'm born and raised in the town, lived there for many years. So for what you've done, fantastic. So yeah, started off in a big 3 form-entry primary school in Blackpool, and started off in year 5, and then went to year 6. Got stuck in year 6, almost like the Twilight Zone. Went in, could not find a way out. 8 years later, as I tell the children when I got schools, I crawled out of year 6.
Were you a performing teacher? Were you
a performing teacher?
You know what I mean? There are some teachers that are a bit sort of dour, aren't they? And they're on it, and there are others that are sort of lively and happy.
I think I had my moments, definitely. I think if you were asking me what sort of a teacher I was, I think probably I was a character teacher. I think I taught on character, and yeah, you know what that means. So yeah, got out of year 6 and realised when I looked in the mirror that the hair had gone, all the crease lines. And then realised that there was a life outside year 6. So I escaped to year 3, then year 4, year 2. And then after 15 years of teaching, started creating stories and putting them in books. And that was 11 years ago. Wow. So 26 years I've been working within the education system, and working with children, without doubt, is the best part of the job, and always will be.
So was writing, reading, your real passion as a teacher? Were those the things that you really pushed hard? And
definitely. And I think you're either maths or you're English. I think anyone who's both, I take my hat off to them. And I was definitely English. And I think I almost came alive in those writing lessons where the ideas were having to be generated, and to see children create ideas, use their imaginations, just that was the buzz. And I think that sort of made me think, hang on, you've got something here. I've got stories, but teaching being the job it is, I just did not have time to write.
Yeah.
So yeah, English definitely. And as we talked before the record, I can remember numerous children who the writing was just amazing. And I have everything crossed that some of those children did go on to become authors themselves, hopefully.
It's time though, doesn't it? Writing takes time, and you need time to develop a story. You need time to actually physically get it onto the paper, and you need time to think about what those stories are going to involve. And I think we said before that it's important that teachers give time for those sorts of activities.
And when I'm talking to the children in school, and they say to me, Dan, how do you make a story? How does it happen? And I think the first thing involves a bit of daydreaming, because you do that bit of daydreaming and any little ideas that you have in your head, and I like to call those the story seeds. So if you've got a story seed, and that might be something as tiny as possibly a wig in one of my stories. So I was walking past a shop, a second-hand shop, and you could see this wig sort of hanging off this model, this mannequin's head at this funny angle. And the first thing I thought is, I wonder if that wig comes to life. I wonder if that wig helps out in the shop and tidies up at night, and then it gets back in position. So that idea became a story about a crime fighting wig. So the idea, the seed starts off, and once you've got the seed, that thinking time allows it to grow. The more you think, the more you play with ideas, you'll find you hit some cul-de-sacs. Some ideas don't work, and you've got to accept that. As a writer, some things will not work, but sometimes you just hit that bit of gold dust and you think, yeah, that's the one, that's the direction it can go in. And then the story, you start to unfold it. And I think planning, when I was a teacher, children used to think that we did it just to make up an extra lesson. But planning is so crucial, because if you plan a story and you put that story together, and you can see the bits that might work and the bits that might not. And the plan should never be a concrete plan, because the plan might change as the story, takes shape. So yeah, the planning, I think, is crucial, and all of that prep makes writing a story so much easier. And I think children, when I go into schools, we look at generating ideas, and from an idea you can grow a sentence. From a set of sentences you can grow a paragraph, and your story starts to take shape. So I think, yeah, planning, build up is crucial, definitely.
Right. So I'm thinking about when children watching this, how useful is it to share your planning with a friend of yours, somebody that you're comfortable with? I mean, and do you do that? Have you got a confidant, that you can do that with?
Yeah, I'll be honest with you. At the planning stage, I don't tend to share too much, because the planning, to most people, it would make no sense. If you were to see my plans, there are notes, there are squiggles, there are little illustrations, all sorts of notes that to the untrained eye would not make any sense. But I know how it works. And it might be that there are post-it notes stuck around. It might be that I add bits. So to most people, it wouldn't work. But I do involve other readers. Once I've got a first or second draft and the story starts to take place, then I get other people, fresh eyes. And I need people that are, for a use of it, the best word, brutal. I need people who will tell me the bits that work, the bits that don't work. I don't need people who tell me that they really love the story and it's fantastic, because I know at a first or second draft it isn't fantastic. I know that there are bits that don't work. So yeah, definitely. And in schools, I see a lot of children in classes, and they'll sit and they will share bits of story, and they'll let the other person listen, and they've almost got a critical friend, someone who can feed back and tell them the bits that do and don't work. But at a planning stage, it is all on me, literally all on me.
I think when you're planning, when you're doing something creative, my problem was, say we were designing a course, a leadership course, and we'd be buzzing about creative ways we could do this and the other. And I'd sort of make some notes, make some plans. I'd get home, look at my piece of paper, and it's got a triangle, a square, a line and important underlined, and that's it. Because my thinking brain doesn't translate into something that's written as a plan, and
Spot
so
on.
Yeah.
I need to work straight away from what's up here. I can't do that interim bit.
Yeah.
Did you have a book or a little pad? Because I always think of my daughter was quite a, well, still is a decent artist, so she'd always have a little sketchbook, a little small sketchbook. But do you have a similar sort of sketchbook, notebook? Because sometimes musicians would often say they'd hear a phrase, you know, oh, don't go down there, might be the phrase. But they can use that as the basis of a riff or of a chorus within a song, and they write it down immediately and then go back to them. So how do you capture these sorts of ideas?
Yeah, and capture is the perfect word, because when I talk to the children, and anyone listening to this now, you've got to see an idea as a living thing. So ideas don't like being caught. They don't like you capturing them. They almost try to hide. They stay out of sight. But if you spot one and you see it, then you've got to jot it down. Now, many years ago, a good mate of mine bought me a notebook, and this notebook on the front says weird observations. And that just about sums up my way of thinking. I see some weird and crazy ideas that straight away I jot down. You've got to have some sort of jotting book, because I think if you've got something to put your ideas down, it might be at the time the idea just doesn't work. You know, years ago, I had a moment when I saw this kid with the most incredible bogey hanging down his nose, and it was the most incredible thing, almost swinging like a pendulum. And then he used this superpower ability to draw this bogey back up his nose, and he sniffed it back up. It shot back up. So when I went back to my weird observations book, I just put mutated mucus, kid with bogey superpowers, and I left that alone for a good while. And then that idea started to stew. The seed started to grow. And over time, I created a story called Hot Shot Snot, about a kid who can control his mucus and he can fire it around. So from one idea, one tiny little thing, that whole story grew. So yeah, definitely get a notebook, jot your ideas down. If you can capture them, keep them, and then make them grow into stories.
You used a lot of alliteration there, didn't you?
Yeah, I love alliteration. I do, but that's probably the teacher in me, isn't it? You're probably never going to take that out of me, you know. Alliteration, chucking a fronted adverbial now and again, and yeah, I know. And when I'm talking, so I've got something here. So these are the actual drafts. So this is from World Saver. So when I go to schools, I take these out, 30 odd pages, and you've got about 25,000 words. And I say to the children, I don't want you to see this. Why? There's something in here I don't want you to see. And then they're thinking, what? And someone will say, is it the plot? No, it's not the plot. It's something begin with M, and then the mistakes. Exactly. So then we start pulling out the second draft and the third draft, and this goes on and on, because the idea is that the first draft is never the best draft. And the craft of writing is as much editing as it is putting the ideas down onto a page. So I do the standing joke in school, you know, put your hand up if your teacher's ever said, go and have another look at it. And all the hands go up, the teachers are covering their head, because that's what, as teachers, that's what we say to the children, go and have another look, make it better, make it the best it can be, because first draft is never best draft.
Yeah. I mean, there's a little character behind you, isn't there?
So yeah. This is Eric, and this kid travels wherever I go, and I've got to do a name check. So Eric, I can't draw from, you know, to save my life. I can do the words, I can make the stories, but I can't draw. So I work with an incredible artist illustrator called Martin Spohr, and Martin creates the illustrations for the Eric stories and for the Impossible Tales. So Eric is a bit of a down on his luck little boy, and I've got a little extract to share, and hopefully the children who are listening will, if you imagine, try and build a picture in your head. So use my words to build a picture and imagine the scene that's going on. And this is character building. Here we go. Let's see. Every child appeared to be enjoying their 15 minutes of freedom away from the classroom, with the chance to take in some fresh air, despite the day being cool and somewhat chilly. Everyone that was, apart from one young boy, who was tucked away at the end of the yard, sitting all alone on a muddy, footprint-covered bench. He cut a lonely, isolated figure, and his brown, greasy hair blew in the gentle breeze as he sat with his arms tightly folded. The metal zip of the boy's parka coat was pulled right up to his chin so that he could play with it between his chapped, sore-looking lips. A dot-to-dot puzzle of scattered freckles covered the pale, nearly translucent-looking skin on his face. Heavy black rings below his eyes were evidence of too many late nights and a real lack of quality sleep. Daydreaming and staring into oblivion, he was rhythmically swinging his black shoes back and forth, scuffing the heavily worn soles on the tarmac. The gaping holes in the knees of his trousers demonstrated the battering they'd had every day since they'd been purchased many months ago from the charity shop in town. The fact that they sat hoisted high above his sock tops signalled that they were now clearly a few sizes smaller than this lanky 11-year-old actually required. Unfortunately, the chances of him getting a new pair anytime soon were slim to non-existent.
Wow.
So,
So
I'd like to ask you now, thoughts. What are your thoughts on
well,
that?
go on, Stan, you go first.
Well, the first thing it made me think of, which is nothing to do with your character description, it was the bench. Because I've been in a few schools recently that have what they call the friendship bench. And it's a bench, if you are feeling like your character is, you can go and sit on it, and others recognise that really you want somebody to have a chat to, have a talk to, and encourage people to come and join them. So my thoughts on that was developing a view about what the bench sees, what the bench knows, what stories can the bench tell about people making friendships or not.
Wow.
So that's where I went.
I'd never ever thought of it from the point of view of the bench, but I like the idea. And one thing I will say, Stan, to follow that, I wanted you to feel sorry for the kid. I wanted you at the start to buy into him. I didn't want the kid to be the school captain of the football team. I didn't want him to be the A-grade student. I wanted you to root for him. I wanted you to want him to do well. And the fact that he is isolated, he's almost a kid who is quite happy in his own company. He doesn't seek other people's company. He's quite happy sort of doing his own thing. And I think that element some children do resonate with, that they do, you know, that situation. He's comfortable in that situation. He doesn't want to go and play football. He's quite happy to sit and watch the world go by and talk to anyone who comes and passes him by. So that definitely about the bench, the friendship bench. I do like that. I like that idea. And maybe someone would come and join him.
Yeah.
But I've got story about that. A friend of mine who was a teacher in a special school. You might know Dave Parks. You might know him. He's a friend of Kendra's. But he was in a special school and they were doing all these activities, including line dancing. And as he was sort of going around doing his patrolling, he saw this little lad in a wheelchair who was looking at the window at the kids line dancing. And he thought, we think we're inclusive and we're doing something now that are not allowed. So he got the wheelchair, took it into the hall with the others dancing, and was proceeded to do dozy does with the wheelchair and everything. At the end of the session, he said, "How did you find that?" And the lad said, "I like watching it through the window."
Interesting. Interesting.
I think for me, the thing that struck me was I think when you say, can you develop the character? All right, children. Well, certainly from my experience, some children find it really difficult. You know, they go to, you know, their first port of call is, you know, their age, you know, how tall they are. But what I thought in your description is, you know, the references to at the end where the trousers were too short. You didn't say the child was poor. You know, a lot of children would write, you know, it comes from a very poor family, or the parents or carer doesn't have much money. But actually, you referenced it without saying that he was poor. You know, so the trousers were worn, the trousers were too short. You know, the gap between the trousers and the shoes, all of that made that point. And I think that's something which good, you know, I mean, clever writers, but I'm going to say good, but sort of observational writers can draw that out, can't they? And I think that's something children, perhaps when they're describing characters, should use that example that you've given as a way of looking beyond the child, to sort of don't just describe the child, look at why is the child dressed like they are, reference back to the journey to school. Do they do that on their own because nobody wants to walk with them, because their trousers look dirty, or whatever it may be, because you're drawing, aren't you, to making us feel sort of sad in a way for this young person's experience. So that's for me where I went with it.
And I think when a lot of people read that's your first chapter, that is your opening chapter, and I think when a lot of people read it, it was almost a bit of a gasp moment, and like, hang on a minute, where are we going with this story? You've launched into this description of a child that we feel brutally, really so sorry for. How are you now going to make this an uplifting story? But I needed you to buy into him. I needed you to want him to succeed. And at the start, that was the way that I thought I could do it. So what you've just said and alluded to there, Frank, it's all about show, not tell. And children, right. Show, not tell is a real skill, because to say that someone is moving fast across a playground, the kid was running, you can do that and you can tell us. But if you say the human hurricane of a child whirled across the yard, skittling children, to the left and the right, then you give that feeling of speed and but it is difficult, really difficult. And sometimes you have no option but to tell and to say what's going on. But if you can make the reader use their brain and the inference skills that I know teachers love children to use to read between the lines and work out what's going on, I think that makes the reader work as hard as the writer has worked creating the story.
That's an interesting activity then, isn't it?
When I go into schools, one of the I mean, I have loads of different writing workshops, but one of the top ones looks at creating what you would class as a schoolyard bully. And this kid is a real menace. And we're looking at creating what he looks like. We're looking at building how he behaves to show his character. And they're also the reaction of the other children in the scene. So all of that filters into building a character. And that can be done in schools. I do that in 3 paragraphs with a bit of speech at the end to finish it off. And children create their own parallel version. So the idea is beat the author. That's the challenge. You create something, not physically. I do have to instill that in the children. Don't start coming at me, across tables with rulers and fist flying. But you can now try to create something. You create a parallel character. That's your challenge, and right. That is a great piece of writing in schools. Yeah.
So in terms, we haven't spoken in this chat about how you work as an author. And the sorts of things that you do to, transitioning from being a teacher into an author, you've lost your regular income, and that means for younger children that, that when a teacher works, they get paid at a certain time in the month. Well, when Dan left teaching, that disappeared. So everything became important for the writing. So I'm interested in how you sort of move from teaching and what your sort of pattern of work is and how you actually sit down and write something.
Okay, so when I left teaching, and yeah, you're exactly right. My income stopped. So at the end of the summer, my final summer as a teacher, when we got to September, my income stopped and I did not get paid. So when I didn't have a book, I was writing the first book, creating the first set of Impossible Tales. And when I was writing that book, I did some other work, some tutoring and running workshops and stuff like that, little bits that I could work around my writing. Now I've got 6 books. And my life, it's almost like a jigsaw. So it might be some weeks I might not write at all.
Right.
If I've not got a project on the go, I might not write. December tends to be a good month for writing because schools have got so much going on. I don't visit a lot of schools in December, so I get a full month where I can sit and write. Now, some days I can sit down at 7, 8 o'clock in the morning and I can write for 6 or 7 hours. If the ideas are there and everything's flowing, I can just carry on.
How many words would you get out of that session?
So that's a good one. So it might be that I can put down a couple of thousand words, 2,500 words, but then when I go back, a lot of it gets chopped.
That's
So it's
it.
almost like the brain empty. I just write and write and write. And one thing I do see quite often in schools is that you'll get a child who to see a blank piece of paper,
It's frightening.
they just can't get going. They
Yeah,
can't get
yeah.
started. And I'll sort of try and side look to them and have a word and say, you've just got to go for it. You've just got to write. And it might be that what you write, you're not happy with, but you might have a paragraph or a few sentences that you can pull out in the edit and you can use. So the words of wisdom that I instill, you can edit a paragraph, but you can't edit a blank piece of paper. If you've got something to work with, you can create. If you've got a blank piece of paper, it's really difficult. So just try to go for it, try to write, get it on the paper, and then worry about seeing if it's any good.
Yeah.
I know what's in Frank's mind now. When we were working together as inspectors, we had to have a mentor would edit our work, and quite often you'd done a page that you'd sweated blood over, and it just got a blue pen through it all and say, just say they need to do this.
Yeah, but it's funny though, isn't it?
Clarity.
It made us much better writers.
It
You know,
did.
so if I always enjoyed writing, but never really wrote with sufficient rigor. That was the problem. Yeah, and I was always very positive about being creative, but that writing I was doing with Stan had to be accurate. It had to be based on what we'd seen or stuff, you know. And I found that a big challenge. But even though it was quite brutal, I have to say, and you were disappointed, you know, when it came back, because you submitted it hoping thinking it was great, you know, and then it would come back and you'd be deflated. But you have to pick yourself up and go back at it again, because nobody's going to finish that writing for you. You've got to finish it, you know. And in a way, that's the same with you as an author.
Particular a whole page of writing, and the mentor read it all and said, "Do you mean they need to do more writing in school?" And I said, "Yes." He said, "Well, just write that."
And you know, you've just hit upon the value of an editor. So I work with a fantastic editor, and Sandra, the editor, has worked with me for 6 books, and from the start, our relationship author editor has sort of evolved. Whereas at the start, I think I was almost a little bit too much of a teacher as a writer, and my writing has evolved, and you need that independent voice to say, actually, that doesn't work. Yeah. Actually, you've used the word desperately 29 times within one story, and you don't see it. As a writer, you don't see it. You don't see the wood for the trees. You get so caught up in the story, you don't see what's going on within the story. So you can edit yourself, and children in schools, we look at editing workshops and how to improve writing. But going back to the point you made earlier, if you've got a critical friend, someone who will sit and read your writing with you, then that's invaluable, because they will see things that you don't, and you will see things in their writing that they haven't seen.
Yeah. Now we've got about 5 minutes or so. You actually mentioned about show and tell as a sort of mechanism for sort of developing writing. Is there another one that you've got that perhaps you could share that perhaps leads us then to you know, as Stan and I sharing what we're reading at the moment, and then we'll finish the
well, if you buy me a minute and talk about
I will.
books,
well,
and I will find you a little extract. How does
that's
that
very
sound?
kind.
Right?
Thank you very much. I mean, one of the things I tend to read quite heavily and then don't read for a while. You know, I mean, I'm reading all the time, but I mean a novel or a book. And the book I'm reading at the moment is an adult book, and it's called Newborn by a lady called Kerry Hudson. And I read her first book called Lowborn, and Kerry had a very, very troubled upbringing. Very poor. She very rarely saw her dad. Her and her mother were all around the place. They were being kicked out of houses and having to move to different towns because they owed money and things like this. And there was something about the writing. It was written so graphically and so clearly, not using very sort of long words, sort of intricate sentences. It was stark, and I know the starkness of it and the clarity of it meant that I was immediately drawn into her experiences. So this is about Kerry having now being pregnant and living in in Prague, and actually it's all the experiences of a woman being pregnant in a town, in a city just before COVID, and she's quite a late mother for having her first child. So it's a really well written book, and I admire Kerry Hudson immensely for writing in this way. So Stan, what have you got?
Very different. I'm reading some detective novels at the moment as my pleasurable read, but some of the things that Dan's just talked about, this is the second book by the same author that I'm reading. The first book I really enjoyed. The second book feels as though it's been rushed and not edited properly, because there are bits in it, like the time. At 1 minute it's 6 o'clock and he has to get back to the police station, and then when he's interviewing the guy there, it's nearly 5.
Right.
And you think a good editor would have picked that up. Plus, he's tried. I don't know whether he is from Yorkshire, but he's tried to write something now in a Yorkshire accent, and it doesn't work. So he has some of the characters saying right at the end of each sentence, more like Newcastle and Geordies than Yorkshire, Lancashire border. And it jars every time you read a bit of dialogue and there's this word right at the end. So actually, I think a good editor would have said, you don't need to write it in. By the time people are into their second book of yours, they know the characters.
Yeah.
You don't need to suddenly make them sound more Yorkshire than just before. And I just think it's going to put me off this. If it carries on through the book, I probably won't read the third in the series, because it jars. When there are errors in it, it jars. And another thing that Dan's just said is using the same word to describe somebody moving quickly or shuffle. I think this shuffling, everybody shuffles across the room in this, and it's picking up things like that as the reader, it doesn't flow as well as I would like it to, even though the premise of the story is very compelling. There's just a little bit about the writing that's not quite there. I perhaps should have said my sister's written and published 3 books, none of which I've read.
Well, actually, I have to say,
romance novels.
Yeah, my brother wrote this called Lasting Joy, and he's been a guest on here, and yeah, it's a great read. I read that and forgot it was my brother, So we're seeing whether we can get a publisher.
The other thing I'm reading, Frank, is this.
Oh yes,
which is about Shackleton, who's my hero, and he's probably the only hero of that era that wasn't wasn't fighting a war or fighting battles. He was leading, doing some exploring in the South Pole, but Frank actually saw that in a shop in Wales, was it?
It was, yeah.
Sent it me knowing he's one of my heroes. Not
So
Frank.
Dan, so just to sort of finish this off, can you give us another sort of like help in hand, a sort of leg up for a teacher?
Okay.
Stuff?
So, firstly, I've got to say, I'll Stan, I'll stick you down on the proofreading editing list for future projects. It sounds like you've got a keen eye. I like a critical eye. Yeah, I like that. And yeah, then that's the thing, and when it's down to human, a human being editing, proofreading, there will be things that slip the net, and it is a really difficult process. And the readers will see stuff. So I don't think, I can't ever recall I've read this before, but in the Eric stories, in the trilogy, Eric lives with his dad, and they live in a little flat, and their life is perfect. They have a chippy tea on a Friday, beans on toast is another favourite, and they spend the time watching classic action movies. And Eric yearns to he wants to be an action hero. So Eric's dad is a real character. And I think when I created him, I wanted him to have a really special relationship with his son. And this is Eric returning back to the flat, and he's trying to find Dad. Eric abandoned his search and headed back to the lounge to find his dad. Eric found him slumped in the chair in the corner of the lounge, fast asleep. The dozing man's hairy belly peeped out from the gap between his t-shirt and tracksuit bottoms. His wiry moustache was twitching and wiggling as he dreamed. Dad's shaven head was tilted to one side. His mouth was wide open, and a single string of drool dribbled from one side of the cavernous entry and onto the shoulder of his faded t-shirt. What a beautiful sight. Snoring loudly in competition with the television, which was playing to itself, Dad was clearly in a deep slumber. So the picture that the illustrator created, you can see Dad.
Oh, wow, yeah.
And he's snoozing away. And and I love doing this in schools. If I read the Eric extract, that is what you heard earlier. So he's there on the front cover on his bench, with his parker on, his wild hair, and his holes in the knees of his trousers. But yeah, I love him. I love him. And the villain in the story is called Ivana de Cash. And Ivana de Cash is she's a great villain and great fun to write. But I think Eric and his dad, the relationship that they have will always be something special. And I'm proud that I've created that.
So in a way, an activity for a teacher taking this forward is to describe a relationship. So we talked before about describing the character, the show and tell bit. Actually, to describe a relationship actually is something I'm thinking. I'm not quite sure I've done that as a teacher. I've often talked about the character, but never spoken about the relationship or asked children about relationships.
I think within a short section, a paragraph, a couple of paragraphs, you can build a character, you can give clues. I think the relationship builds through a story. I think you drop little bits in here and there, whether it's the way that Eric, sort of goes to his dad and his dad goes to the tin and he pulls out his change and he gives off you go, son, get to the chip shop, and the way he speaks to him, and it's quite endearing. The relationship that they have and the way that they get on, I think, builds across a story. Probably trickier to build a relationship in a short piece of writing, easier in a story.
I also think it's very difficult to maintain that if you're writing a series of books, because as the writer you have to understand how that relationship works, because if it goes out of sync, people who are reading will notice that's not how he should. That's not how he would react. That's not what he would do.
Yeah, continuity is a real tricky one. But I think Eric and his dad, their relationship, it sort of waxes and wanes. And in the first book, his dad doesn't feature as much. But in Danger Zone, the second book, his dad is kidnapped, and his dad is totally reliant on Eric saving his life. So I think the relationship changes. And then in the third book, he doesn't feature as much again, but he's almost like the sort of support mechanism for Eric on the adventure that he goes on. So I think, relationships are really hard to build across series of books, definitely.
Okay.
I think you've also got it once you've got that relationship, and you, as a reader, you start to understand, you think, how the character's thinking. You then get to the standard horror thing, won't you? No, don't do that. Don't no. Who would possibly go down a cellar at night looking for that? Yeah, in your mind you want them to, because you want to know what's in the cellar in the dark.
And I've got to tell you this, and the children asked me, will there be another Eric? And we've mulled over a possible spin-off, and at the moment nothing is set firm. But when I finished the third book, it was the weirdest feeling, because it was almost as if my time with Eric and his dad was done. And they'd been such a big part of my life for 5-6 years. They were real. I was living their life. And when it came to an end, that was really difficult. And it was almost like separating my life from their life. Then I can move on and create something else.
Now,
what was Eric's dad's life like when he was Eric's age?
So you know what? I've not got a backstory for Dad. I've not got a backstory at all. And Dad is someone who wants to do well in life but struggles. And Eric is almost a bit of a support mechanism for Dad, I think, at times, that he supports him as much as Eric looks up to his dad and appreciates him. So it's quite a complex dynamic at times between the two of them. But I would imagine that Eric has got a little bit more about him at his age than Dad had at his age, in comparison.
I'm going to bring it to a close here because we're nearly at getting on to 40 minutes. So
Wow.
yeah, it's amazing how these chats just sort of have a life of their own. But Dan, I know that you do a lot of work in schools. I mean, if a teacher, I don't think they'll be able to get you for World Book Day because I suspect you're booked up to them. But in the future, I mean, this happens outside of World Book Day, doesn't it? I mean, this is a big chunk of your life. But if they wanted to get in touch with you, how would they do that?
Okay, so my first message: every day should be a World Book Day. I get inundated, and other authors are inundated, illustrators, storytellers, for the one day. And right, World Book Day is not the one day that we promote reading and writing. It should be a drip feed, year-long process. So yeah, I'm available for visits. At the moment, I would say May onwards. I'm totally booked up till then. Which is the self-employed dream, really. But yeah, danworsley.com on my website. There's my email is on there, and you can make contact. Days are bespoke. I can visit. We can do storytelling. We can do writing workshops, bit of both. And I work with children from EYFS right the way through to year 6, and I've even worked with some high school children.
Wow.
So that's a bit scary.
Okay, well, thank you all. Thank you for watching. Thank you for listening. Thank you, Dan, for coming back.
Thank you.
All being well, we'll have the 4th edition in 2025. So until then, good luck with your reading, writing, listening, speaking, or whatever you're going to be doing. I hope you take some of the messages from Dan today and improve your work because of it. So we'll see you all next week. Take care, everyone.